Hi, this is John Mick, field agronomist for Pioneer with your agronomy update for August the 6th. Corn growth stages have been much ahead of normal all summer, and we're anticipating some early black layer dates. So what does all this mean? Well, right now it means an early harvest, but the impact on yield depends on if the grain fill period gets shortened up from this point on. Anytime the grain fill period is shortened, it will hurt yields by hurting that final yield component, which is your kernel depth or kernel test weight. Now there are four main yield components on corn. The first is your number of ears per acre. The second is the number of kernel rows on an ear. The third is the number of kernels long, and the fourth would be your kernel depth or test weight. Now everybody likes to get out this time of the year and look at those first three yield components in an effort to somewhat predict what kind of year we're going to have, or even compare fields or hybrids and look at things like nosing back to see what's going to happen. I want to challenge that notion just a little bit. I think one of the most important yield components is that last one, which is yet to be determined, which is our kernel depth. That is what I want to focus on today. So how do we influence kernel depth as managers? My message this week is that producers should be getting out and evaluating things that can influence late season kernel fill to see if we can still influence these. Let me give you a few things to consider. Number one is foliar disease management. Did your fungicide decision protect enough leaf tissue to support kernel fill, or will you see nosing back and shallower kernels at the end because the leaves simply got loaded up with too much disease pressure? In this case, we have some pretty high gray leaf spot pressure on this plant. Fungicides are a great tool because they help keep plants alive longer, promoting that deep kernel development. Second thing to look for is spider mites. Spider mites are still in play in many fields. Spider mites do damage by pulling sugars out of the leaf which were destined for the ear. Too much spider mite feeding and kernels don't reach their full depth because they don't have the sugar they need. Another factor to consider is your nitrogen status. At this point in the summer, you should see a little bit of yellowing on the bottom 1 to 3 leaves as plants remobilize that nitrogen and move it to the ear. But if you see nitrogen deficiency as high as the ear zone, you're probably not going to keep the plant alive long enough to maintain kernel depth. Poor root development is yet another factor to look for. A soil probe is the best way to detect that. This last week I started to notice some premature death symptoms showing up in area fields, which is always an indicator of root restrictions. If I see this, I'm going to modify my irrigation strategy towards the end, knowing that I probably will not be able to pull moisture from those lower depths because the roots have been impacted. This brings up irrigation strategies. From this point in the summer forward, I think we need to think differently about our irrigation strategy. Most of the summer, we've been very aggressive, trying to stay ahead and soak the field fairly deep. We need to shift that more to a just-in-time mentality right now. As corn backs off water use, it can be easy to oversaturate soil, promoting some root decay, which leads to premature death and shallower kernels. So maybe a little more frequent irrigation with not as much depth is a good thing to think about. Be careful with this. Don't be a cloud worshiper delaying your irrigation in the hopes of receiving a rain. As corn gets into the growth stage where it has a starch line moving down, it's very sensitive to moisture deficits. If it senses that, it can shock the plants into prematurely maturing. This is irreversible once it happens. Once you've stressed the corn, you can't undo that. So there you have it. I encourage producers this week to look at fields with the perspective of finding ways to keep your corn crop alive for as long as possible for that maximum kernel depth. From your Pioneer Field Agronomy team, this has been John Mick. Thanks for watching and have a safe week.